Hello and welcome to Chain Reaction, a new podcast series examining America's role in the world. I am your host, Aaron Stein, Director of Research at the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia. Every 2 weeks, we'll talk to experts about a variety of topics and why it matters for U.S. foreign policy. On this episode, we discuss the current state of U.S. Turkish relations, the Biden administration's approach to Turkey, and broader tensions in the Eastern Mediterranean, and what policy options the Biden administration has to manage them. Hello and welcome. Today we're talking to Nick Danforth, non-resident fellow at the Hellenic Foundation for European and Foreign Policy. Nick, good to have you back on the show.
Thanks. Good to be here.
I thought I would have you on because there's been a lot of, churn and turmoil in the Turkish press about the fact that recently elected President Joe Biden has not yet called Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. And I think it's a good time to talk about sort of the state of U.S. Turkish relations and all of the issues that are permeating throughout the bilateral relationship. So perhaps we'll start right there. What are your impressions? We're only 45, 50 days in of the U.S. Turkish relationship under President Biden.
Look, it's not. Everyone knew it wasn't going to be good. There's no evidence that it is going to be good. I think Biden has handled, the impossible challenge that he got stuck with about as well as possible by not really doing much. There's an enormous amount. There's always an enormous amount of pressure to try to engage with Turkey, to try to put forward a positive agenda. And I think, I appreciate the fact that Biden has so far resisted that and really put the ball in Turkey's court. Not calling, as you said, it actually has gotten a reaction from Ankara. And I think what makes it an effective gesture is that, if the United States had done anything to try to get tough with Turkey, had taken, they came in with CAATSA sanctions already in place, if they'd taken, more aggressive positions on sanctions, it would have been easy for Erdogan to turn that to his advantage. He would have showed it as a hostile gesture coming from Washington. What's great about not calling is, if Turkey's whole line is that we have an independent foreign policy, we don't need the United States anymore, it's really hard to get mad at the United States in that context for not picking up the phone.
It's been surprisingly effective. To the people who came up with that, I applaud them because it really is elegant in its solution to something that I know that you and I and many others have grappled with, which is how do you deal with the Turkey problem. I think of it as we've come to the place in the relationship where it's the most transactional I can ever remember it. I don't think that the U.S. looks at Turkey as necessarily hostile. I just think they look at Turkey as we'll talk where we have interests, and where we disagree, the ball is in your court to basically come to us if you'd like to try and reset the game here. What do you think about that? Do you think that we're at a stage of ultimate transactionalism? And do you think Ankara was actually thinking about this type of transactionalism when it was saying it indeed wanted to get to a more transactional place with the U.S.?
Well, I never fully understood I guess the problem is from Ankara's point of view that, the transactions they want are for the United States to stop doing things they're unhappy with. And that's, they never quite figured out how to initiate that transaction. If what they wanted was the United States to stop supporting the YPG, they were actually fairly effective in that. They managed to use a combination of bluster, a combination of appealing to Trump on something that wasn't really a transaction, but that they managed to make Trump think was a transaction. And I guess, if they thought that combination, if they thought the combination of kind of bluster and, outreach that didn't really cost them anything was effective with Trump and would be effective with future presidents, then that seems like a great model for them. I can understand why they were enthusiastic about it. I just don't... I don't understand how that's going to work with a Biden administration.
In one respect, and I heard this put out by a colleague, I was chatting with on the phone the other day, and I thought that was an interesting way to think about it, is, for all of the Basically during the Trump administration, we had about a 4-year case study with some interludes, but more or less an uninterrupted 4-year case study of the policy that I like to say, which is give them a hug.
Right.
You had Donald Trump, President Trump, who we now know, and we did know in the moment, but it's become more clear, was exerting political influence down through the bureaucracy to shield Turkey, um, both from being on the receiving end of sanctions for its purchase of the Russian S-400, but also perhaps a little bit more nefariously, if you ask me, was trying to exert political leverage on the resolution of the Halkbank case, which is the case for the Turkish bank that had been involved in in violating U.S. sanctions on Iran. And so, if you have that on one hand, right, which is the let's give them a big hug, we'll try and make everything right, and you had the U.S. asking of Turkey to do a few things, which is essentially make some minor compromises on the S-400. The Biden administration thus far is in the opposite direction, which is you have to come to us rather than us go to you. How would you judge maybe the 4 years of the Trump administration, through that lens of the case study and whether or not it was effective at all in trying to shape Turkish behavior?
And I guess maybe that explains better than I just did what I think the problem with transactionalism is and why I don't think, it is a feasible basis for the relationship, because the things that the United States, even under Trump, saw as concessions, the things that we thought as giving Turkey a hug, doing something, going overboard to accommodate them, Turkey saw as the baseline. But so if at the point where they thought the Halkbank case was politically motivated to begin with, what we saw as political pressure to stop the case, they saw as the default. If again, we thought supporting the YPG was our national interest, our policy against ISIS. Obviously, ending that would be a concession to Turkey. Turkey saw that as a hostile action towards them and expected us to stop it just to get the relationship back to square one. So I think, I think that's why even with Trump, as you said, giving Turkey a hug, it was still hard to get the relationship on good terms. It was still hard to get Turkey to make concessions over things like the S-400. That's going to be even harder with Biden. They said obviously support what he's doing, but not starting from the position of taking these steps on Turkey's behalf.
So I want to push forward, and think about a little bit about where we're going. I think we're very clear in that the Biden administration is doing the cold shoulder approach, which doesn't preclude cooperation where there is overlaps in interests, but it's not going out of Washington's way to try and find those interests. But if you project forward, I think it's very clear that the Biden administration, we're recording this on Tuesday. It's March 16th. It is 8:48 p.m. And both the Secretary of State Blinken and Secretary of Defense are doing their first trips outside the United States during coronavirus. It's no mistake that they're going to Asia. It's quite clear that the Indo-Pacific is the top priority of this administration. And on the back end, they're going to even meet with the Chinese government officials in Alaska. So this is where we're going, right? So some of these things, particularly maybe in Syria, which is such a big irritation in the bilateral relationship, I do think will kind of fall by the wayside, just won't be given much priority. And if it's not given much priority, you get the churn for basically status quo. And that status quo is just the U.S. staying in Syria and staying with a partner force that Ankara doesn't like. So if we're talking a year from now that U.S. policy in Syria hasn't changed all that much, how do you think that this will impact the bilateral relationship?
Right, and I've heard people offer the take that the pivot to Asia, the declining interest in the Middle East will somehow alleviate the tensions that have been plaguing the U.S. Turkish relationship. But no, for the reasons you outlined, I don't necessarily think that's the case. I think there will, as the administration tries to turn its attention away from the Middle East, there will be a tendency, like you said, to keep things on autopilot. And there will also be, I think, an increased frustration with countries or actors that aren't letting the United States take its attention elsewhere. And I think the risk for Turkey, the risk for U.S.-Turkish relationship is that, be it in Syria, be it in the Eastern Med, Turkey through its policies will be demanding attention. And precisely when the administration doesn't want to spend its attention on the Middle East, that will make it even more aggravated with Turkey and make it more inclined to try to handle the issue posed by Turkey by deferring to all of our partners in the region who, quite frankly, are fed up with Turkey and would like nothing more than to enlist whatever U.S. attention they can get in trying to contain Turkish influence in the region.
I do want to turn to the East Med, because if you think about where U.S. priorities will be coming, I mean, obviously we just talked about in the Pacific, Syria might be on autopilot, but I do think that the East Med may get a little bit more attention than perhaps it has in the past, because there's a return of a greater Russian presence there. Russia obviously is a priority for this administration as well, but also that it's a flashpoint. And can you talk a little bit about sort of what's been happening and how Turkey and U.S. interests intersect in the East Med, perhaps bringing in some of your Europe experience as well, given your affiliation?
So we can go into as much depth about this as anyone wants. The basic dynamic that's shaped up in the Eastern Med is between, again, Turkey's managed to fall afoul of all of the United States partners and allies in the region. For a range of different reasons. Turkey's hostility with Greece goes back a long time. It's has a practical side. It has a nationalist side. Turkey's tensions with Egypt, it's an ideological issue between Erdogan and the Sisi regime. Turkey's issues with Israel. Again, there's an Islamist angle to Erdogan's opposition to Israel. There's also plenty of secular anti-Israeli sentiment. Cyprus, again, longstanding nationalist issue where Turkey's on the wrong side of the Greek Cypriot government. Now you have a situation where all of these individual bilateral disputes have become enmeshed precisely because the countries that Turkey were facing off against are increasingly deepening their economic and political and now military cooperation, in part for very specific things like exporting and developing the natural gas resources that have been found in the southeastern Mediterranean over the last decade. But also, quite frankly, because they're worried about Turkey.
Yeah, and I don't think you can separate some of the moves to bandwagon. It's sort of a case study in international relations. Like if I did teach the East Med to students, but if I was teaching sort of the modern day bandwagoning against a superior military, I would point to the actions of Greece and Cyprus and bandwagoning with U.S. partners in the East Med. But I think it's precisely because the changes in Turkish foreign policy that stem from sort of a series of interrelated decisions to use force in both Syria and in Nagorno-Karabakh, sort of at the tail end of its Syria interventions. So all of a sudden it became very real that Turkey could actually choose to use force in their backyard.
Right, and on one hand, Turkey's very proud of this. On one hand, it in concrete military terms has been successful in places like Libya and Nagorno-Karabakh. On the other hand, the use of force, coupled with a lot of the irredentist rhetoric that you're getting out of Ankara now, has alarmed people. I think sometimes more than Ankara suspected. I think Ankara, in part because it's assumed a lot of these countries were inherently hostile to it, hasn't fully appreciated how its rhetoric and its actions have actually created the hostility that it imagined.
Can you start at the beginning, perhaps walking the listeners through? I mean, look, the tensions over the demarcation of territory, EEZs, continental shelves, all of these overlapping issues is longstanding. This isn't necessarily a new issue, but I do think that what's happened, I backdate it realistically, and the more modern things is to the conclusion, I should say, of the memorandum of understanding between the Libyan GNA and the Erdogan government for a maritime boundary that essentially ignored multitudes of Greek islands and extended Turkish territorial waters, at least between these two countries, in ways that many people think are, say, a little too maximalist for anybody's taste.
Right. That's a perfect example of how I think some of the steps Ankara has taken have changed the perception of its role in the region in ways that it didn't fully anticipate. I mean, everyone knows that Greece and Turkey have longstanding issues. While the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea would have given Greece, in a very extensive exclusive economic zone, people were sympathetic to the fact that Turkey had refused to recognize that UN convention because it did seem, uniquely unfair to Turkey. There was some frustration with Turkey's position, but people, I think also understood where Turkey was coming from in its refusal to accept Greece's position on the Eastern Mediterranean. Also, quite frankly, before natural gas had been found in the region, it wasn't a big deal one way or the other.
It was one of those things where it was one of those boring, unresolved disputes that didn't really mean much until there was hydrocarbons involved.
Exactly. And so the combination of there being hydrocarbons involved, Turkey feeling left out on the development of the hydrocarbons, Turkey being, I'm sympathetic to Turkey's position here, upset by the way the failure of the Annan Plan went through in Cyprus in 2004, with the Turkish Cypriots voting for the plan, the Greek Cypriots rejecting the plan, Cyprus entering the EU in spite of that. Then another round of negotiations that failed in 2017. Turkey's frustration with both of these issues, I think, was understandable. I think people had some sympathy for it. Unfortunately, Turkey, not having another outlet for that frustration, decided to handle by making the maximalist claim via an agreement with the semi-recognized, UN-recognized, but nominal government in Libya, which, again, as you said, it was so completely in defiance of the UN Convention that it was really hard for anyone to see it as, anything other than an irredentist claim. It was hard to see it as the beginning of a negotiating position. In that shifted the dynamics in a way that made it hard to see Turkey as kind of negotiating for something that other people might at some point agree with, and really made it seem like Turkey was simply trying to play a spoiler role and could only be dealt with not through negotiations, but with containment.
Right, and it brought a military aspect to this, where the disputes over the EZ, yes, there were high points of tension between the Greeks and the Turks. Everybody points to the Imia Kardak crisis of, when was it, 1996? There was the Cypriot missile crisis, a personal favorite of mine, which is how you get an S-300 on Crete. It's not as if this place was, this part of the world was conflict-free, but the extension, the Libya MOU brought in a military component that was always there, right? But I think it definitely made it more sort of multinational. It stopped being about Greece and Turkey bilaterally, right? Which everybody could kind of sweep away as, oh, these ancient cultures. I'm doing air quotes for people here on the podcast. Historically hate each other, and this is just sort of boys being boys or people being people, right? All of a sudden, this became a multinational type thing because it brought in Cyprus, because it included Greece. You had the European Union, which has to show solidarities with its member states.
Right.
You have the overarching regional conflict, which is competing sides in Libya, which the Egyptians on one side, along with the Emiratis, the French, and even the Russians, against sort of a cadre of against the UN-backed government, which is the Turks and the Qataris. And this has an Islamist, non-Islamist overlay to it. If you bring all this stuff together, it congealed to form this sort of perfect storm, where this maritime, and then on top of it you had the gas dispute, and I want you to talk about that next. All of it comes together. So while multitudes of issues got shoved together and became about basically containing Turkey as a mechanism to solve this, and Turkey saying we don't want to be contained.
Right.
And before we sort of pivot to the end here, I mean, like, the gas dispute is something that doesn't have easy resolution, and I think just reported in the press either this morning or yesterday. I mean, time has no meaning any longer. It becomes even contentious for the laying of undersea cable between Cyprus and Israel because of the continental shelf dispute. So if you can just go into a little bit sort of the dynamics over the hydrocarbon issue and how this is contributing to all of this stuff going on.
So the actual natural gas that was found, and this part of the problem is simply geographic, that Turkey didn't actually find any of it in what could even plausibly be considered its exclusive economic zone. The actual deposits were between Israel, Egypt, and Cyprus. Mm-hmm. And so again, Turkey had better relations with these countries, it actually would have been in a good position, and it was in negotiations with Israel to play this role would have been in a good position to actually serve as the route through which this natural gas was exported to its presumable destination in Europe. The problem was Turkey's geopolitical tensions with all these countries were great enough that none of them were particularly eager to do this. And again, look, I mean, when it comes to Turkey and Egypt, Turkey has been consistent in denouncing General Sisi as a putschist and a dictator and a murderer, all of which is true. Turkey refuses to recognize the government of Cyprus, which again, I think Turkey, given the way that Annan plan fell out, Turkey has some legitimate concerns there. Similarly, I'm critical of plenty of stuff Israel does. That's part of the equation with Turkey. But at the end of the day, when Turkey has particularly bad relations with all of the actors at play here, it can't seem particularly shocked that none of them were eager to invite Turkey into the Eastern Med Gas Forum, that none of them were eager to make their profits from developing this gas dependent on export through Turkey. And so the fact that they're considering, a remarkably expensive, possibly impossible pipeline, deep sea pipeline route via Cyprus and then Crete, as an alternative to Turkey, I think, it's understandable why Turkey's upset about this, but it's also a testament to how effectively Turkey alienated all these countries.
It's true. And I think, sort of to put a bow on this, the U.S. has traditionally sought to balance between Greece and Turkey.
Right.
It was official policy. I mean, right down to the provision of arms to both countries throughout the totality of the Cold War. The embargo placed upon Cyprus. The U.S. did, to its credit, seek to play a mediating role in this, to limited effectiveness, but it was, I do believe, well-intentioned. I do think at the tail end of the Trump administration, and I think that this is continuing into the Biden administration, is the U.S. has quite clearly tilted towards Greece. Like it just has. And a lot of this, I think, is a testament to the current Greek leadership, which is sympathetic to the United States and sees the United States as part of this. It sees an opportunity to offer itself as an alternative to Turkey. Bandwagon with us because we're the less basket case of the two. And I think that this has found a sympathetic audience in Washington. I think this has caught Turkey off guard as well.
And I think that's where, going back to 1952 or before, I think the U.S. approach to Turkish-Greek tensions is that Washington just wished they would go away. But in order to make them go away, and as you said, Washington has often been somewhat unsuccessful with this, that America's approach was to try to balance between the two sides, was to try to promote negotiations between the two sides. Increasingly, and again, this is where things like the Libya MOU come into play, increasingly as the problem starts to be seen as Turkey's provocations rather than this kind of eternal Turkish-Greek hatred, however false that might have been, then increasingly when Washington wants to make these problems go away, it sees the way to do that, as you said, as being siding with Greece to constrain Turkey rather than playing the neutral arbitrator. And so yes, even if the goal of making these tensions go away remains the same, the way of doing that, as you said, is now entails pivoting towards Greece.
Yeah, and if Greece is going to be more amenable to tangible things that the U.S. wants, which is like basically basing access, it's kind of a no-brainer to lean into that. And again, we could have political change in Greece, and things will kind of go up in smoke.
Can I throw in one thing on that?
Yeah, go ahead.
I feel like when the United States has to deal with tensions in the Middle East or the Balkans, its preference is always, and there could be some problematic stereotypes and Orientalist assumptions behind this, but its preference is always for the country that seems to be acting in the least Balkan way. And Turkey in the early AKP years played into this beautifully. I remember being in a talk where someone asked Ahmet Davutoglu, a very hostile question about the Aegean. And he said, the question is not whether the Aegean is a Greek sea or a Turkish sea. It's how we can make the Aegean a sea of peace. And who knows what the hell that meant, but it went over very well with listeners.
Right.
And now I think Greece has stepped up to play this role. You look at the previous Greek government's handling of the Macedonian dispute. That was a dispute. I understand why it's important to people in Greece and Macedonia, but no one in DC was ever going to understand that dispute. No one in DC was ever going to care about that dispute. And the Greek government's efforts to solve that, I think, again, that just played very much into what DC wants to see from countries in the region, which is behaving, from Washington Standard as the kind of grown-up in the Balkans. And that, as you said, Greece did that. It knows what America wants, which is things like basing accents. It's given them to the United States. That's made it very easy to make this pivot happen.
I mean, the U.S. ambassador in Greece has been an effective advocate for their position, and so there are personalities at play as well.
Who would a U.S. ambassador in Turkey be now that could be an effective advocate for Turkey's position? I mean,
that's right. Yeah,
a bigger part of the issue
Satterfield is a pro. By all accounts, he's a pro and he's very good at his job. But sometimes you're kind of defending the indefensible. I guess the final question here is: many analysts sort of attribute this, and I think it's correct to a much degree, is in the East Med. So much of these tensions beyond just being sort of Turkish and Greek, obviously that plays out on the island. And you reference the Annan Plan, which was the closest I think we've ever gotten, which was to solving the Cypriot dispute. The Turks were much more forward-leaning, we should say, than the Greeks. And I think to this day, Erdogan carries a grudge, and not without reason, that he put himself out there, and that they were willing to make compromises, and it was quite literally voted down. With changes in the Turkish Cypriot government, obviously changes in the AKP government. This is not the same AKP from 2003, 2004 as it is in 2021. They are now pushing quite clearly for two states, two-state solution, which goes against all the UN Security Council resolutions. We all know we know the Cypriot dispute. You know it a little better than I do, but more or less, the model is a loose confederation of bizonal states with a weak central government, which I always kind of laugh about. Do you think that there's an opportunity here for the Biden administration to play a positive role? I think there may be, but perhaps I'm being too American-centric. But I do think that this is one dispute where the U.S. could try and resolve, and it could try and at least get back to that position of playing a mediating role. Do you think there's any opportunity there?
Again, I mean, as long as Turkey's talking about a two-state solution, that's going to make negotiations really hard.
Explain. Because Turks will say that when they voted down the Annan Plan, they de facto gave the one-finger salute, and the Greeks basically signed up for a two-state solution.
Look, as I said, I'm more sympathetic to that than a hell of a lot of people. The problem is, look, in practical terms, I don't even know what a two-state solution means. I mean, technically, Turkey already claims the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus is independent. Maybe at best they could get Azerbaijan and half of Libya, probably not even half of Libya anymore, to recognize the TRNC. I'm not sure in practical terms how much good that would do. But it's one of those, even if it is a negotiating position, it's such a forward negotiating position that it makes it really hard for anyone else to assume that Turkey is engaging in the negotiations in good faith. It seems like the Greek Cypriots, I don't think they're holding their breath, but people prefer negotiation to conflict. They're willing to see where this goes. Look, maybe I'll step back and say what's hard to tell about Turkish foreign policy right now. I think they've clearly realized they're too isolated in the region. They've clearly realized that being at odds with everyone is not good. They've gone on a charm offensive where they've insisted that they're on the verge of restoring diplomatic relations with Egypt. They're about to have a rapprochement with Israel. They're going to have one with Saudi Arabia. Maybe they'll even have one with the Armenians. And repeatedly, this has just turned out to be propaganda that Ankara is putting out. And, you repeatedly have country leaders from all these other countries basically denying the progress that the Turkish government says they're making. What's not clear to me, at the point where Turkey's tried to break out of its isolation by pretending it's restoring ties with everyone without actually doing any of the things to restore those ties, when the point it realizes that doesn't work, I don't know what the next step is. It's possible that, even if it's not prepared to make real concessions, it will be eager to at least try to make it look like there's some substance to, ending its regional isolation. And I do think engaging with the talks in Cyprus might be one of those areas. I don't think this means there's going to be a solution. I don't think, the Biden administration should invest a huge amount of capital into trying to have a solution. But again, negotiations are better than conflict. And, stringing the negotiations along as long as no one is fooling themselves, I don't think is the end of the world.
No, I agree. The sort of feints towards reset without making concessions, there's a tendency to kind of dismiss it as bluster and as a mechanism to try and alleviate economic woes, but it is better than the alternative, right?
Right.
And the alternative, the alternative is far worse because it sets you at least onto a pathway of indirect conflict. So let's hope it's sincere and it continues because it's better than the alternatives. So with that, Nick, we've been talking for about 30 minutes here, so I think we'll call it a night. So with that, thank you for joining the show.
Fantastic. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of Chain Reaction. Be sure to subscribe to Chain Reaction on iTunes and Spotify, and don't forget to follow us on Twitter at the handle @FPRI. Chain Reaction is a podcast of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, a nonpartisan think tank in Philadelphia. For more information about this and other initiatives, be sure to visit www.fpri.org.